For decades, the conversation around global warming focused on atmospheric physics and future mitigation targets. Today, advances in attribution science and empirical econometrics have translated those physical changes into precise, retroactively actionable financial liabilities. According to a 2026 econometric analysis from Stanford University researchers, greenhouse gas emissions generated by the United States since 1990 have directly caused over $10 trillion in global economic damages. This figure is the direct output of a quantitative framework that links past emissions from specific national sources to monetized, location-specific reductions in gross domestic product, or GDP, the total monetary value of all finished goods and services produced within a country. The researchers intentionally restricted their primary macroeconomic damage calculation to emissions that occurred exclusively after the year 1990. 1990 marks the publication of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's first assessment report. This date establishes a legal and scientific threshold, marking the point when the economic and physical risks of greenhouse gases became universally known to sovereign policymakers, effectively ending plausible deniability. By isolating damages that occurred after this threshold of knowledge, the monetization of historical emissions pivots the global focus away from collective, voluntary climate action and moves directly toward specific national and corporate tort liability. To understand the scale of this liability, we must look at the physics of carbon accumulation. Because carbon dioxide acts as a long-lived stock pollutant, remaining in the atmosphere for centuries, the increase in global surface temperatures scales near linearly with cumulative global emissions over time, rather than just the amount emitted in any single year. Between 1850 and the present, the global economy has emitted approximately 2,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Tracing territorial emissions since the mid-19th century reveals a stark asymmetry. The United States has released over 509 gigatons of CO2. That single nation accounts for roughly 20 to 25% of the entire global historical total. While the United Kingdom was the world's largest emitter in 1850, the United States surpassed it by 1887. Fueled by rapid industrialization and continental expansion, the U.S. maintained this dominant position throughout the entire 20th century. It wasn't until 2006 that China's rapid economic expansion led to it surpassing the U.S. in annual emissions. Despite China's current lead in yearly output, per capita emissions in the United States remain persistently elevated. Among the top 10 historical emitters, the U.S. maintains the highest emissions per person, double those of China, and approximately 8 times those of India. This legacy of sustained, carbon-intensive industrial expansion places the United States at the absolute top of the cumulative hierarchy, making it the primary target for retroactive financial damages. Proving that a single nation caused exactly $10 trillion in damage requires a scientific mechanism built on a but-for legal standard. Researchers simulate the modern macroeconomic world with historically observed U.S. emissions and compare it against a counterfactual baseline where those specific post-1990 emissions never occurred. This process relies on a multi-stage modeling architecture. First, emissions inventories are fed into the Finite Amplitude Impulse Response, or FAIR, model, an emulator that translates greenhouse gases into global temperature changes. Then, the CMIP6 ensemble pattern scales those global averages down to highly localized, grid-level temperature and precipitation alterations. Once local temperature and precipitation anomalies are established, they must be translated into financial damages. This translation is the most complex component of climate economics. This chart illustrates the traditional macroeconomic level effect. Under this assumption, an extreme weather event causes a temporary dip in economic output for a specific year, but the model assumes the economy fully recovers to its original baseline trajectory the very next year. This updated chart tracks the contrasting BHM growth effect. Empirical data proves that climate anomalies do not merely affect absolute output in a single year. Instead, they permanently lower the long-term baseline growth rate of a nation's GDP. When an extreme heat wave damages physical infrastructure, degrades agricultural soil, or forces the diversion of financial capital into reactive disaster recovery, the underlying economic trajectory is degraded. Some working papers, like a 2024 NBER study, claimed global warming permanently reduces world GDP by up to 20%. However, traditional economists note these models often conflate short-term natural weather variations with long-term climate trends. The Stanford researchers avoided this by relying on localized, pattern-scaled relationships. Because the BHM model tracks permanent growth impairment rather than temporary dips, the financial losses compound annually over decades. This compounding math explains the multi-trillion-dollar scale of the historical liability. The high-resolution economic models reveal a severe spatial asymmetry in how this damage is distributed. Because the relationship between local temperature and economic productivity is nonlinear, temperate zones degrade only slightly, while already hot, low-income tropical countries are pushed past biological, labor, and agricultural productivity tipping points. This map shows the specific spatial distribution of the macroeconomic fallout. The data confirms that U.S. emissions alone are responsible for an estimated $500 billion in direct macroeconomic damages in India and $330 billion in Brazil. This represents a massive, uncompensated transfer of sovereign wealth. The poorest nations are essentially subsidizing the historical wealth of the highest historical emitters by physically absorbing their negative externalities. Yet the most counterintuitive finding of the 2026 report is the vast extent of self-inflicted harm. Of the total global economic damage caused by U.S. emissions since 1990, nearly $3 trillion fell squarely within the borders of the United States. This domestic impairment operates through multiple specific vectors. Prolonged droughts and disrupted precipitation consistently depress yields for foundational U.S. crops like corn, soy, and wheat, while an increase in extreme heat days depresses outdoor labor productivity in sectors like construction and mining. Additionally, rising sea levels and the physical intensification of hurricane storm surges have forced billions of dollars to be diverted into reactive coastal infrastructure, resulting in vast and permanent property devaluation across these regions. The empirical revelation that the United States sacrificed $3 trillion of its own GDP output to fuel its carbon-intensive growth effectively refutes the axiom that unmitigated fossil fuel consumption always optimizes national wealth. While sovereign states establish the regulatory frameworks that permit mass emissions, the actual extraction, refining, and combustion are executed by corporate entities. The current econometric attribution framework has advanced enough to target specific, highly capitalized corporate entities directly. Between 1991 and 2020, extreme heat linked to carbon dioxide and methane from just 111 major fossil fuel companies cost the world economy $28 trillion. Applying this framework yields staggering individual liabilities. Emissions tied to Saudi Aramco resulted in $3 trillion in global damages by 2020. ExxonMobil's past emissions caused an estimated $1.6 trillion in economic damages over that same timeframe. The granularity of this attribution architecture now extends past corporate megastructures down to the micro level, evaluating the hyperconsumption habits of ultra-high net worth individuals. Evaluating the specific carbon footprints of elite private aviation reveals that a single year of private flights taken in 2022 by individuals like Elon Musk will generate more than $1 million in discounted aggregate global damages by the year 2100. By explicitly quantifying these specific individual damages, the public discourse regarding elite hyperconsumption moves away from qualitative moral arguments and crosses directly into identifiable, calculable tort liability. While the historical $10 trillion figure is arresting, the most alarming insight derived from the Stanford framework is its projection of impending future liabilities. Because carbon dioxide is a long-lived atmospheric stock pollutant, past emissions mathematically lock in inescapable future costs. Driven by the thermal inertia of the world's oceans and the deeply compounding nature of depressed GDP growth trajectories, the true economic tail risk is heavily backloaded. Future damages from historical emissions are estimated to be 10 times higher than the damages already recorded. The researchers quantified this temporal lag with granular precision. 1 metric ton of carbon emitted in 1990 caused roughly $180 in global economic damages by 2020. However, because that carbon remains in the atmosphere, that exact same ton is projected to cause an additional $1,840 in compounded damages through 2100. This multiplier dictates that simply settling debts for past damages is insufficient. Historical emissions remain an active liability on the global macroeconomic balance sheet, continuously suppressing future baseline growth. Despite these massive figures, the $10 trillion calculation represents only the floor of total liability. The macroeconomic metric of national GDP is ill-equipped to capture massive non-market losses. Current economic models poorly capture emerging epidemiological threats and direct human suffering. The warming of the land mean annual maximum daily temperature, known as TXX, has outpaced the rate of global warming itself, increasing the risk of hyperthermia and mass human heat mortality. Furthermore, GDP cannot quantify the loss of cultural homelands and ecosystem services, such as the physical erasure of vulnerable sovereign island nations like Tuvalu due to encroaching sea levels. It is critical to distinguish this process from the social cost of carbon, which is a forward-looking metric used by governments for regulatory planning. Historical attribution is a backward-looking forensic procedure, estimating the impact that historically emitted gases have already inflicted. The data illustrates the penalty of delay. Independent modeling indicates that putting off systemic policy action before the year 2030 guarantees $10 trillion in additional, entirely avoidable global economic costs. Equipped with these specific calculations, the global response framework is shifting away from voluntary international aid. As attribution science becomes more precise, the world is moving towards climate Superfund jurisprudence, where legal claims are built directly on high-resolution forensic data.